We are turning now to a network exclusive on the incredible story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She was convicted of murdering her mother, a woman who from the outside looking in seemed like the perfect mother, nursing her daughter, who she told everyone was seriously ill and in a wheelchair since childhood. Well, I sat down with Gypsy for a revealing conversation about her extraordinary life and the circumstances surrounding her mother's death.
What would drive a girl to plan her own mother's murder? A woman who clothed her, fed her, and sat beside her in hospital after hospital, holding her hand through what the world thought were life-threatening illnesses? But what if the illness was a lie? When Claudine D.D. Blanchard was found stabbed to death in her Springfield home, sympathy poured in for her sick, disabled daughter, Gypsy Rose, who was thought to be missing, maybe kidnapped by her mother's killer. What the police uncovered next unraveled everything. The feeding tubes, the oxygen tanks, the wheelchair, it had all been staged. D.D. had forced Gypsy to fake illnesses she never had, shaved her head, removed her teeth, controlled her every move, and even had doctors remove her salivary glands. The world had been watching a well-orchestrated lie, and the girl they thought was a helpless victim, she was the one who opened the door to the killer. This is not a story of villains and saints. It's a twisted knot of deception, control, trauma, and blood, wrapped inside one of the most haunting questions of modern crime. Who's the real victim when your whole life was a performance? Claudine D.D. Blanchard didn't just tell lies. She built a life on them. Born in 1967 in Chack Bay, Louisiana, D.D. grew up in the swamplands of the Gulf Coast, surrounded by suspicion from her earliest days. Family members would later say she was manipulative, a thief, and not above poisoning a relative if things didn't go her way. As a young woman, she worked briefly as a nurse's aide. But it was in her role as a mother that D.D. found the perfect stage for control. In 1991, D.D. gave birth to Gypsy Rose, after marrying a 17-year-old boy named Rod Blanchard. The marriage ended before Gypsy was born. But what started as a broken relationship soon evolved into something far darker. D.D. began to report that her infant daughter had sleep apnea, then leukemia, then muscular dystrophy. She claimed Gypsy had seizures, chromosomal defects, asthma, and needed a feeding tube. Doctor after doctor found nothing. But D.D. always had an answer. If test results were clean, she said the old records had been lost in Hurricane Katrina. If a diagnosis didn't stick, she claimed Gypsy had something else. She shaved her daughter's head, kept her in a wheelchair, and slowly erased the truth of who Gypsy was, replacing it with a porcelain doll of permanent illness. She forged documents, faked medical histories, and lied about Gypsy's age, knocking years off to make her daughter appear more childlike. From their early years in Louisiana to their new life in Missouri, D.D.'s script became more elaborate. Doctors grew uneasy. Some, like Dr. Bernardo Flasterstein, suspected the truth, but most were deceived or too cautious to challenge her. After Hurricane Katrina tore through Louisiana in 2005, it left behind more than physical devastation. It gave Claudine D.D. Blanchard the perfect opportunity to rewrite her story. Claiming their medical records were destroyed in the storm, D.D. and her daughter Gypsy relocated to Missouri, stepping into a new town with a new script. The narrative was simple. A single mother caring for her terminally ill daughter, displaced by disaster and trying to rebuild. Communities tend to rally around tragedy, and Springfield, Missouri, did exactly that. Habitat for Humanity gifted the pair a wheelchair-accessible home. Complete with a ramp and a hot tub, it was a symbol of compassion, but it also became a stage. D.D. and Gypsy were hailed as local heroes, and charitable support poured in. Free flights to hospitals, a Make-A-Wish trip to Disney World, backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts. Everywhere they went, doors opened. But behind the applause, Gypsy was trapped. She had stopped going to school as early as second grade and was homeschooled, if at all, under D.D.'s watchful eye. To neighbors and the press, she was a frail, childlike teenager. In reality, Gypsy was 18. Dee Dee had forged documents, fabricated birth dates, and shaved Gypsy's head to mimic chemotherapy. When Gypsy showed signs of normalcy, Dee Dee doubled down. Feeding tubes replaced meals. A wheelchair replaced walking. Even Gypsy's stepmother would later say, they could have handed her an Oscar. But Gypsy wasn't acting, she was surviving. In the quiet of the night, when Dee Dee Blanchard's vigilant eyes finally closed, Gypsy Rose found her escape, not through the front door, but through the glowing screen of a computer monitor. Dee Dee's iron grip on Gypsy's life was nearly unbreakable, but the internet became a secret portal to the world beyond her mother's control. Late at night, Gypsy would quietly access the internet, exploring realms her mother had forbidden. She ventured into Christian dating sites and created secret social media accounts, yearning for connections that felt normal and genuine. It was during one of these clandestine online sessions that Gypsy met Nicholas Gaudejon, a young man from Wisconsin, on a Christian singles website. Their conversations quickly intensified, delving into shared fantasies and desires. Gaudejon introduced Gypsy to the world of BDMS, and they began to explore complex role-playing scenarios. For Gypsy, who had been infantilized and controlled her entire life, these interactions were both thrilling and liberating. She later claimed that the BDSM elements were more of Gaudejon's interest, but she participated nonetheless, eager to please and connect with someone beyond her oppressive home life. Gypsy confided in her neighbor, Alea Woodmansey, about her online relationship with Gaudejon. Alea, who believed Gypsy was much younger than she actually was due to Dee Dee's fabrications, was alarmed by the explicit nature of Gypsy's messages and the speed at which the relationship was progressing. She tried to dissuade Gypsy, fearing she was being exploited by an online predator. However, Gypsy's desperation for love and independence blinded her to the potential dangers. As their online relationship deepened, Gypsy and Gaudejon began to fantasize about a future together. They discussed marriage and even chose names for their potential children. But Dee Dee was an insurmountable obstacle. Gypsy knew her mother would never allow her the freedom to be with Gaudejon. The fantasy of love and normalcy soon morphed into a dark plot to remove the barrier between them. They began to conspire to kill Dee Dee, believing that her death was the only path to their happiness. In March 2015, Gypsy orchestrated a meeting between Gaudejon and her mother at a movie theater. She planned for them to accidentally encounter each other, hoping to introduce Gaudejon as a potential friend. However, the meeting did not go as planned. Despite this setback, their resolve to be together only strengthened, and their discussions about murdering Dee Dee became more concrete. Gypsy's late-night internet escapades opened a door she could never close. What began as a search for companionship and understanding spiraled into a deadly conspiracy. The digital world that had offered her a taste of freedom ultimately led her down a path that would end in tragedy. Gypsy had tried to run, not once, but multiple times. The image of a smiling, wheelchair-bound child was only a facade. Behind it was a young woman, desperately clawing at the walls of a prison her mother had built around her. Her first major attempt came during a sci-fi convention in 2011. It was one of the few events Dee Dee allowed them to attend, and the only place where Gypsy could blend in among costumed crowds without attracting suspicion. There, she met a man she'd been secretly chatting with online. She escaped to his hotel room, hoping this would be her way out. But the fairy tale collapsed quickly. Whether it was convention-goers or Dee Dee herself who intervened, Gypsy was found and forced back into her mother's grip. Dee Dee threatened police involvement and manipulated the situation with lies and fake documents. Gypsy's hope was crushed. Then came the BB gun incident. After another failed attempt to escape and a confrontation at home, Gypsy, now more desperate than ever, grabbed what she thought was a real gun. She pointed it at her sleeping mother and fired. It wasn't a real weapon, just a BB gun, and Dee Dee survived. But the intent was clear. Gypsy was at her breaking point. Dee Dee's retaliation was vicious. She destroyed Gypsy's computer and phone with a hammer. She allegedly chained her to the bed and starved her for weeks. She told Gypsy she'd filed paperwork with the police, stating her daughter was mentally incompetent. Gypsy believed it. She thought that even if she escaped, no one would help her. No one would believe her, not after years of doctors, neighbors, and even police officers turning a blind eye. In private, Gypsy began spiraling. Trapped, isolated, and afraid, she considered ending her own life. But that, too, felt like letting Dee Dee win. Gypsy wanted freedom, not death. And in her mind, there was only one path left. She had to eliminate the problem. If Dee Dee wouldn't let her go, Gypsy would have to make sure she could never stop her again. On June 9th, 2015, Nicholas Gaudijon boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Springfield, Missouri. He had made this trip before, but this time it wasn't for love. It was for murder. Gypsy had sent him money stolen from Dee Dee's hidden stash, over $800. She knew her mother kept thousands in the house, money that came from child support and charitable donations. When Nicholas arrived, Gypsy and her mother were at the emergency room for another medical procedure, a routine replacement of her feeding tube. Nicholas lingered nearby, quietly watching. There, for the first time, Gypsy introduced him to the real world her mother controlled. But no confrontation happened. Not yet. That night, Gypsy and Dee Dee painted each other's nails. It was a moment that should have been tender. Instead, it became a ritual of goodbye. Gypsy tucked her mother into bed and promised to be a good girl. Once Dee Dee was asleep, Gypsy texted Nicholas the signal. It was time. Nicholas entered through the back door. Gypsy handed him a knife, gloves, and duct tape. Then she ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and covered her ears. What happened next was savage. Gaudijon stabbed Dee Dee 17 times in the back while she lay sleeping. The attack was brutal, and it was final. Dee Dee never woke up. Gypsy claims she cried quietly in the bathroom while it happened. Nicholas later said the act didn't take long, but the wounds told a different story. In the hours that followed, the line between trauma and desire blurred. The two retreated to Gypsy's bedroom. Nicholas said they had sex. Gypsy later alleged it was rape, that he had forced himself on her. Angry that she hadn't let him carry out a fantasy of raping Dee Dee before the murder. She said she called out for help to her mother's spirit as he assaulted her. Together, they packed what cash they could find, around $4,400, and fled. They spent the next 2 days in a motel, shopping at local stores, sharing fast food, and mailing the murder weapon, the bloodied knife, back to Nicholas's home in Wisconsin. Gypsy thought they had gotten away with it. She thought they were finally free. The escape ended with a bus ride north. As the Greyhound pulled away from Springfield, Gypsy left behind the house, where she had spent her entire life as a prisoner, and the mother whose control had ended in blood. On June 14th, 2015, 5 days after the murder, a post appeared on Dee Dee Blanchard's shared Facebook account. It read, in all caps, "That bitch is dead." Below it, a chilling comment followed. "I slashed that fat pig and raped her sweet innocent daughter. Her scream was so f***ing loud, lol." It was vulgar, shocking, and completely out of character for the sweet, childlike mother-daughter duo the community thought they knew. The post sent panic across Springfield. Friends began calling, texting, and messaging Dee Dee with no response. One after another, those calls rang unanswered. Some tried to contact Gypsy, but no one had seen or heard from her in days. Neighbors, knowing the pair's complex medical needs, feared the worst. If Dee Dee was dead, where was Gypsy? Could she survive without her wheelchair, oxygen tank, or feeding tube? Several of them rushed to the Blanchards' small pink house on West Volunteer Way. Dee Dee's modified car was still in the driveway. The lights were off. There was no movement inside, despite knocking, yelling, and peeking through tinted windows. There was no answer. Concerned neighbors contacted the police. Officers arrived but couldn't enter the home without a warrant. That's when one neighbor climbed through a window. Inside, nothing appeared ransacked. Gypsy's wheelchairs were all still in the house. Something was horribly wrong. Once the warrant was approved, police entered. In the bedroom, they found Dee Dee's body, bloated, bloodied, and decomposing in her bed. She had been dead for days. Gypsy was nowhere to be found. The immediate assumption was abduction. The local community feared Gypsy had been taken or harmed. A GoFundMe was launched within hours to help with funeral expenses and a possible search. But as investigators dug into the disturbing Facebook post, they traced the IP address. It didn't lead to Missouri. It led to a quiet neighborhood in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The next morning, law enforcement in Waukesha County moved in swiftly. Inside Nicholas Godejohn's family home, they found both Nicholas and Gypsy. She was walking, unaided. No wheelchair, no oxygen, no feeding tube. She had never needed any of it. Back in Springfield, the reaction was one of disbelief. For years, Gypsy had been seen as the frail, helpless daughter of a doting mother. Now, she was standing in front of police, physically capable, with no signs of illness. The arrest marked the moment everything unraveled. Dee Dee was dead. Gypsy was walking. And the story the world thought they knew was about to be torn apart. When the news broke that Gypsy Rose Blanchard had been found alive and well, walking, speaking clearly, and showing no signs of the numerous conditions she'd supposedly lived with, shock turned into utter confusion. In the days following her arrest, police issued a statement that left the entire community stunned. At a press conference, Greene County Sheriff Jim Arnott delivered the now infamous line, "Things are not always what they appear." That sentence cracked open a reality no one was prepared for. For years, Dee Dee Blanchard had painted her daughter as a terminally ill child, wheelchair-bound, mentally challenged, fed through a tube, and barely clinging to life. But now the very same girl was standing upright, clearly coherent, and obviously not who the community had been told she was. Investigators uncovered a tangled web of lies. Dee Dee had forged documents, falsified medical histories, and manipulated doctors into prescribing unnecessary medications and treatments. She shaved Gypsy's head to mimic chemotherapy, limited her education to keep her from asking questions, and restricted nearly all access to the outside world. Gypsy was never truly sick. She was the victim of a decade-long psychological prison orchestrated by her own mother. As the truth unfolded, public sympathy underwent a seismic shift. What had first appeared to be a cold-blooded killing of a devoted mother was now being re-examined under the lens of abuse, unrelenting, calculated, and deeply disturbing abuse. Local news stations flooded with interviews from neighbors who had once brought over casseroles and volunteered their time for charity drives. Many were heartbroken, embarrassed, and even angry. The house that Habitat for Humanity built, the free Disney trips, the concert meet and greets with Miranda Lambert, all of it had been built on a mountain of deceit. Some neighbors couldn't forgive Gypsy's role in the murder. Others saw her not as a killer, but as a victim who had been failed by every adult, doctor, and institution meant to protect her. A once sympathetic community now felt duped. Donations given in good faith were seen as exploitation. The little girl in the wheelchair had become the young woman who exposed one of the most disturbing frauds in recent memory. And with every new detail that surfaced, the narrative kept shifting. This was no longer just a murder case. It was a story about how far one mother would go for control, and how far her daughter had to go to escape. When Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn were finally in custody, the deeper layers of the case began to emerge. Not just what they had done, but how they ended up here. behind the Facebook post and the brutal murder was a disturbing psychological entanglement that prosecutors, investigators, and even the public struggled to understand. During intense interrogations, Gypsy offered full cooperation. She recounted the abuse she had endured at the hands of her mother and described how she had met Nicholas online. But even as she told her story, questions surfaced. Was she the victim of manipulation? Or had she been the one pulling the strings? Nicholas Godejohn, diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, dissociative traits, and a long history of mental instability, painted a different picture. In his mind, Gypsy was his soulmate, and in their private conversations, she fed that idea. Investigators retrieved countless saved chats from Gypsy's secret social media accounts. Their messages weren't just romantic, they were dark, sexual, and theatrical. She created personas like Ruby and Candy, engaging in BDSM-themed roleplay with Nicholas. Some of the exchanges referenced violent fantasies, including rape and domination. In court, the lines blurred further. Among the evidence was a chilling video Gypsy had sent Nicholas, an instructional walkthrough of how to enter the home, where to find Dee Dee's bedroom, and what to do once inside. The prosecution used it to paint her as the orchestrator of the murder. Yet, the defense argued something else entirely, that Gypsy had been emotionally broken, desperate for freedom, and had clung to the first person who offered her love, even if that love came wrapped in dysfunction. Nicholas, on the other hand, exhibited obsessive and erratic behavior. He believed Gypsy was his destined partner, and reportedly told investigators that murdering Dee Dee was what any good man would do for the woman he loved. And then came the most disturbing detail, the rape fantasy that prosecutors referenced. Nicholas claimed that before the murder, Gypsy had talked about him raping her mother. When she refused to let him follow through, he later said he would rape someone. And after killing Dee Dee, he forced himself on Gypsy. She later told investigators that she called out for help from her dead mother during the assault. So, who was in control? The emotionally stunted man with a violent streak and a warped view of love? Or the young woman who had spent her life under lock and key, and now manipulated the only person she believed could set her free? The courtroom was left divided. One side saw a mentally vulnerable man led astray by a calculating girl desperate to escape. The other saw a lifelong abuse victim, traumatized and alone, who found herself tangled in a dangerous relationship she couldn't fully comprehend. In the end, there was no clear hero. Only two people bonded by fantasy, fear, and a fatal decision. Rather than pursue a death penalty or life sentence, Greene County prosecutor Dan Patterson called the case extraordinary and unusual and offered Gypsy a plea deal. She pled guilty to second-degree murder in 2016 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was a decision many saw as just. After all, she had endured over 2 decades of psychological and physical torture. But it also sparked a debate. Should someone who planned a murder, even under duress, be allowed to walk free in a decade? Nicholas Godejohn did not receive the same leniency. Though Gypsy never testified against him, his own interviews with law enforcement, and the messages and videos they exchanged, left little doubt that he was the one who committed the physical act. In November 2018, Godejohn stood trial for first-degree murder and armed criminal action. His legal team tried to argue diminished capacity due to his mental health diagnoses, including autism and dissociative identity disorder. But the jury didn't buy it. They returned a swift verdict, guilty on all counts. Godejohn was sentenced to life in prison without parole and an additional 25 years for armed criminal action. It was the most severe penalty possible, even though he had acted at the urging of someone who had clearly been abused. The court of public opinion was just as divided as the courtroom had been. For some, justice had been served. Gypsy had paid her dues, and Godejohn had taken a life in cold blood. But others saw it differently. How could the man with a documented mental illness receive the harshest punishment while the mastermind of the plan would be walking free by 2023? Godejohn's defense argued he had been emotionally manipulated by Gypsy. He believed he was rescuing her. In one statement, he told the court he had acted out of love. And years later, that argument hasn't gone away. In 2023, Godejohn's legal team filed an appeal seeking a new trial. They claimed that key evidence was withheld. Videos showing Gypsy emotionally controlling Nicholas, including an instructional clip guiding him through the steps of the murder. They argued these could have changed the outcome. As the appeal moves through the courts, one question continues to haunt the case. Did the system get it right? Was this true justice, or a legal overreach against a mentally unwell man who was, in his own twisted way, trying to be a savior? In December 2023, after serving 85% of her 10-year sentence, Gypsy Rose Blanchard walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Center as a free woman. The same woman once locked in her bedroom, spoon-fed lies, and forced into wheelchairs she never needed, was now stepping into a world that viewed her with both fascination and unease. Gypsy's release was more than just a legal milestone. It was a media event. Cameras waited. Interviews rolled in. Overnight, she became a household name. From Lifetime docuseries to primetime appearances and exclusive book deals, Gypsy went from inmate to internet icon. And while some were captivated by her transformation, others weren't sure what to feel. In public, Gypsy expressed remorse. She spoke about forgiveness, pain, and the weight of what she'd done. She admitted that if she could go back, she might have told someone, asked for help, or just walked away. But in the same breath, she reminded the world of the abuse she endured, and the prison she was born into long before metal bars. She married Ryan Scott Anderson in 2022 while still incarcerated, hoping to build a life rooted in love and normalcy. But just months after her release, the relationship began to unravel. In early 2024, they quietly separated. For Gypsy, freedom came with its own set of emotional landmines. Outside prison walls, she was a free woman. Inside, she was still haunted. Dee Dee's family, however, offered no sympathy. They had long seen through her lies and manipulation, years before the rest of the world caught on. After her death, none of them claimed her remains. Her ashes were flushed down the toilet, an act that some saw as final justice, and others as a reflection of deep, unresolved pain. The world still wrestles with the aftermath. Was Gypsy a murderer, or a victim finally breaking free? Was Godejohn a pawn, or a predator? Did Dee Dee deserve her fate, or was she another woman caught in her own untreated illness? The truth is, this case lives in a moral gray zone. It's a story of manipulation, survival, delusion, and destruction, where every character is both scarred and scarring. Justice was served by law, but whether it was served by truth, that's a question no court can answer. If this case made you pause, if it made you feel anything, anger, empathy, or confusion, then you're right where you need to be. Hit subscribe, hit follow, because next time we're digging even deeper. And remember, the facts may end, but the questions never do.